bioethics,
law, euthanasia,
consumerism,
politics, terrorism,
globalization,
religion,
migrant population,
interfaith, drug addiction.
In February this year, a Filipino boxing star, elected politician and evangelical Christian, Manny Pacquiao, remarked in a television interview that people who enter into same-sex civil marriage are worse than animals. He was criticized and as a result lost a lucrative Nike endorsement deal. A couple of days later, Manny Pacquiao put up an Instagram post citing several Bible verses, including Leviticus 20:13. The post was taken down after 2 hours, but not before a media firestorm. Several news outlets reported the story as Manny quotes Bible, gays should be put to death. Now, Leviticus 20:13, of course, says, if a man lies with a male as with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination, they shall surely be put to death. Their blood is upon them. Now, while some view this story that I've just told as an instance of media sensationalism, I think we should also see it as an example of how Bible verses have been used with the effect of pushing people, both gay and straight, away from Christ and His church. Often, the use of Bible verses have caused gay people to feel threatened, hurt, excluded, fearful for life and limb. And this is just a reminder as we start that we are discussing not just an issue, because the conclusions that we reach and the posture that we take affects the lives of people made in the image of God. So we need to make every effort, I think, to get this both right on the one hand and loving on the other. 6 passages have been identified to mention homosexual behavior or activity, or to be more specific, same-sex intercourse. These are Genesis 19, 1-9, Leviticus 18, 22, Leviticus 20, 13, Romans 1, 26-27, 1 Corinthians 6, 9, and 1 Timothy 1, 10. These 6 passages have traditionally been understood to say that homosexual activity is wrong. But there's now an ongoing debate about whether these passages can apply to monogamous, consensual, loving gay relations. Now, that seems to be the core question that needs to be explored. No one is really arguing whether gay sex outside a committed relationship is wrong. No one is asking whether engaging a same-sex prostitute or sleeping around with several same-sex partners or seducing a child of the same sex is wrong. Of course they are wrong. These are sin. Even most non-Christians, I think, will not approve of this kinds of behavior. So the core question is whether 2 persons of the same sex can, let's imagine, date, fall in love, commit to a lifelong, consensual, self-giving, monogamous union. And if they do, can they have sex within this union? Does the Bible really address and prohibit these sorts of relationships? Now, opposing answers have been given to this question, with proponents on both sides accusing the other of doing violence to the Bible text. You may be surprised to find out that the majority of Bible or theology scholars who have written books about homosexuality in the last 30 or 40 years, they've concluded that the Bible actually does not condemn consensual, monogamous, same-sex relations. It seems that quoting a verse or two no longer settles the debate. Not that it ever did. Or to put it another way, the debate is not about what the Bible says, the debate is over what the Bible means. So in this session, we'll take a whirlwind tour through some of the 6 passages of Scripture. I'll introduce you to some interpretations, and introduction is all we have time for. We're going to examine them together with the interpretations, with this core question in mind. Just to be clear, throughout, I'm going to use the word non-affirming to describe those who think that God does not affirm consensual, monogamous, same-sex sexual relations. This is what we call the traditional view. And I'm going to use the word affirming to describe those who believe that consensual, monogamous, same-sex sexual relations can be affirmed by God. Okay? Non-affirming, affirming. And that seems to be the agreed nomenclature in the literature. So let's move on. Genesis 19, 1-9. 2 men visit Lot in Sodom. The men of Sodom demand to have sex with the visitors. To cut a sordid story short, the city is judged and destroyed. Does this infamous story in Genesis 19 condemn loving, consensual, monogamous, gay unions, relations? Well, affirming scholars have long argued, no. The men of Sodom, they're not asking to go on a double date with the visitors. They're not going to buy them chocolates or flowers or bring them out to dinner. They were trying to gang rape the 2 visitors. And such an atrocity would have incurred judgment, even if Lot's guests were women. The story is not relevant, so it is argued, to loving, consensual, monogamous gay relations. Now, actually, I think the affirming scholars are onto something here. Sodom's main sin, out of many sins, is a particularly horrific form of inhospitality. Instead of aiding or helping visitors like Abraham did in the previous chapter, they wanted to rape them. And that is why, when Sodom is mentioned elsewhere in the Bible, it's associated with pride, arrogance, injustice, oppression, hoarding wealth, being uncaring for the poor. You see an example in Ezekiel 16. There's very little in the rest of the Bible that actually links Sodom explicitly to homosexual sex. Now, I could say more about this, and people have said more about this, but I think it's better to look elsewhere in the Bible to find clear texts that prohibit all forms of homosexual behavior, not just condemn rape. Leviticus 18:22 and Leviticus 20:13. These next 2 verses mention some sort of homosexual act. You shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination. And then another chapter down, if a man lies with a male as with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination. They shall surely be put to death. Their blood is upon them. But, affirming scholars argue, do Leviticus 18 and 20 prohibit only certain types of exploitative same-sex activity? Now, some say that these 2 verses are only talking about certain types of same-sex activity, things like rape, temple prostitution, or a man on a boy. So they have nothing to say about same-sex behavior in the context of a loving, consensual, monogamous relationship. Are they really limited to these particular types of same-sex activity? I don't think so. First, the commands in these 2 verses, they don't come with any qualifications that limit application to a particular type of same-sex activity. There's no mention of rape. There's no coercion. There's no age or power difference. That's not mentioned. No one is trying to force another person into having sex, like in the Sodom story. Second, you'll notice that if 2 men do sleep together, they are both considered morally culpable, and both are punished. They are to be put to death. Their blood will be on their own head, the verse that got Manny Pacquiao into trouble. The commands appear to include same-sex acts that are mutual and consensual. Both partners are deemed guilty. If you're talking only about some kind of exploitation with an innocent victim somewhere, then only the one doing the exploiting should be punished. That's actually the case in Deuteronomy 22, which lays out the punishment for 2 opposite-sex people sleeping together. If it's mutual, Deuteronomy says both are punished. If there's coercion, only the rapist is guilty and punished. But in this case, both are punished. Now, other interpreters say that Leviticus 18 and 20 only prohibit male cult prostitutes. Now, these are men who offer sexual services to other men in cultic devotion to a pagan god in the precincts of a temple. Now, if this is what Leviticus is talking about, then the prohibitions, of course, have nothing to say about our core question. But the Hebrew word that is usually translated cult prostitute, you see that in 1 Kings 14:24, that word is not used at all in Leviticus. Not in Leviticus 18, not in Leviticus 20. There is scarcely anything in the text or in the context or from history that this prohibition in Leviticus only had male cult prostitution in mind. I should add that this idea that in the ancient world, that in ancient Israel, it was full of pagan cultic prostitution, this idea has now been questioned and challenged by more recent scholarship. Leviticus simply prohibits men from having sex with other males, and there's nothing in the context suggesting that prostitution, whether it's cult prostitution or otherwise, is in view. Well, yes, but isn't the underlying logic of Leviticus 18 and 20 misogynistic? That females are inferior to males. Do we really want to perpetuate this sort of thinking? That's what the affirming scholars have argued. Now, some of them argue the reason Leviticus 18 and 20 gives for prohibiting male-male sex is because it makes and this is the part where it gets a little bit R-rated, it makes the receiver act like a woman. You shall not lie with a male as with a female, as with a woman. The underlying logic is that men are superior to women. In male same-sex intercourse, the receiver is stripped of honor and status because he's acting like an inferior woman. You get the logic? So in other words, if you want to quote Leviticus to condemn homosexual sex, then you must also import its underlying moral logic for the command to work. And that moral logic is an inherently degrading view of women. Do we really want this chauvinism in today's world? That's a pretty interesting argument, don't you think? But it makes assumptions which are not there in the text. Yes, Leviticus 18 and 20 do highlight gender distinctions, but neither of them actually says that the distinctions are because women are inferior. There's nothing in either passage that assumes or requires a low view of women. Men should act like men, yes. Women should act like women, yes, not because men are superior to women, but because men and women are created differently. Different and equal, I should add, both in the image of God, Genesis 1, 26, 27. So the prohibitions against male-male sex in Leviticus 18 and 20, they don't appear to be limited to particular types of same-sex activity. The language in the verses is general. It assumes moral culpability and punishment mutually. There's no mention of the status or the power differential of the male partners. There's nothing that clearly limits the text to prostitution or to rape or to men having sex with boys. The most natural reading of the text is that they prohibit all forms of male same-sex intercourse. Well, what about this? Aren't these prohibitions in Leviticus time-bound? Aren't they culture-bound? They're purity laws, right? They were intended to keep Israel separate for the surrounding nations. That's what we read in Leviticus 18:3. Aren't these purity laws no longer binding on Christians? But here's the argument. As Christians, we are no longer bound to keep Israel's purity laws. So why do we harp on these two verses all the time when we have no problems eating chili crab or bacon cheeseburgers or wearing clothes that mix fabrics? Now, if you think about it, this is probably the best argument against seeing Leviticus 18 and 20 as relevant for Christians today. I think there's some merit to this. I don't think anyone should say that just because Leviticus 18 and 20 are in the Bible, they are therefore binding. This is not only simplistic, but inconsistent. Otherwise, all of us would have to give up eating char siu rice. And nobody wants that, right? On the other hand, neither should we dismiss the text just because they are in Leviticus. After all, there are lots of other laws from the Old Testament that Christians still follow. What we should do, what we must do, is to figure out whether these specific laws are still authoritative, are still relevant for Christians today in the New Covenant age, and if they are, in what way. So here are some things to consider. First, this section in Leviticus, chapters 18, 19, 20, they contain a whole string of commands that deal with various social, not just purity, but social issues in the life of Israel. Almost every law, and this is the important part, almost every law is still relevant for Christians today. I'm going to lay this out, and you can just take a look at it. I'm not going to read everything, But this is what is in Leviticus 18:19 that are still relevant to Christians today. Incest, adultery, child sacrifice, sex with animals, theft, lying. Actually, one of the most central commands for the Christian faith is found in this section. You might recognize it right at the end there. You shall love your neighbor as yourself, Leviticus 19:18. Nobody is seriously going to argue that these are all no longer binding on Christians. Clearly, they are relevant. Many, not all, but many of the laws in Leviticus 18 and 20 still are relevant for us. And then there are a few other laws in Leviticus 18 to 20 that contain a principle or a value that's still relevant for us, even if the specific or the concrete circumstances cannot be replicated. And so Leviticus 19:10 says, God's people, don't gather all these fallen grapes from your vineyards, leave them for the poor. Now, the principle of taking care of the poor is still relevant, but the specific or the concrete circumstances of grapes and vineyards, they don't have to be replicated. They may not be. In short, most of the commands in Leviticus 18 and 20 are either applicable in their full literal meaning or in the underlying principle or value. This suggests, it doesn't confirm, but it suggests that it is more likely that 1822 and 2013 are still binding on Christians in some way. Second, if we were to narrow down our examination to sex, and how often have I wanted to say this to a crowd of 600 Christians? If we were to narrow down our examination to sex, or sex laws, almost all the laws about sex in Leviticus 18 and 20 are still authoritative for Christians. For example, incest, adultery, sex with animals, offering your daughter into prostitution. Okay, there's one possible exception in 18:19, which says that a man shouldn't have sex with his wife while she is menstruating. Okay, I don't know what to do with that. But the point is, almost, maybe all of the sex prohibitions and commands in this section, they are still authoritative. Again, as with the first consideration, it seems more likely that the same-sex prohibitions are still authoritative. Our third observation is the most important one. The best indication of whether an Old Testament law is still valid for Christians is to ask whether it's repeated or taken up in the New Testament. For example, prohibitions against lying, stealing, adultery, murder, drunkenness, all repeated in the New Testament. How about eating pork, animal sacrifices? For these, the New Testament actually says Christians are not bound. So, are the prohibitions against same-sex intercourse repeated in the New Testament? That's what we'll be examining in detail when we go on to the New Testament text. For now, let me just preview that and say that I think the prohibitions are indeed taken up and are authoritative for Christians. But authoritative in what way? What about that death penalty? Now, before we leave our examination of the Old Testament text, there's one remaining task. We must talk about the death penalty. Now, some of us may think that it's obvious that executing men who have same-sex intercourse no longer applies today. But I think we need to realize and to feel how offensive Leviticus 20:13 sounds. Do we know how scary it sounds to gay and lesbian people, especially the majority who have, at some point in their lives, faced bullying, discrimination, hatred, or even outright physical abuse because of their same-sex orientation? Now, many popular-level conservative Christian books, they don't mention the death penalty at all when Leviticus 20:13 is discussed. I think this is a huge blind spot that needs to change. So, when we say that the prohibition of Leviticus 20:13 is still relevant, what do we mean? I think we mean that same-sex relations are still viewed negatively. It is still sin, act of rebellion against God. But the stated judicial punishment no longer applies because God's people are now constituted differently under the new covenant, in which God's dealings with his people are now dramatically changed with the coming of Jesus Christ and the sending of the Holy Spirit. In the same way, adultery is sin, cursing of parents is sin, but the church doesn't put adulterers or sons who curse their parents to death, even if Leviticus 29 and 10 says precisely that. Now, what Paul does in 1 Corinthians 5 provides a helpful analogy. There, a man was having sex with his stepmother, his father's wife. Paul says that this form of sexual immorality was so bad, even the non-believers tak boleh tahan. They cannot tolerate it. Now, here's the interesting thing. Paul didn't say, put those perverts to death. That's what Leviticus 20:11 says. But what Paul prescribes instead is church discipline. Most scholars think that he's instructing some kind of excommunication, to put the offender out into Satan's domain, that is, outside the church, for the express purpose of his eventual restoration, his salvation, 1 Corinthians 5:5. In other words, death is not the last word. Salvation is. So by analogy, is the prohibition against same-sex relations in Leviticus still authoritative for Christians today? Yes. Does the death penalty still apply? No, not literally, but some form of church discipline may, for the purpose of restoration. Now, I know it's cumbersome, but if we wish to use this text in our discussion, I think it's our duty to explain the whole picture, including what we do with that death penalty, and not just cite or quote or tweet the verse and leave it hanging. I think that's irresponsible, and that's harmful. So let's move on now to the New Testament. Romans 1:26-27. Now, most interpreters agree that Romans 1 contains the most important passage in the debate of same-sex relations. In a wide-ranging argument sustained all the way through to Romans 3, the Apostle Paul shows how everyone is condemned without Christ, because we are all under sin. In the section that highlights the sins and the sinfulness of Gentiles, Paul says, "For this reason, God gave them, Gentiles, up to dishonorable passions. For their women exchanged natural relations for those that are contrary to nature. And the men likewise gave up natural relations with women and were consumed with passion for one another, men committing shameless acts with men and receiving in themselves the due penalty for their error." That sounds like a straightforward, get it? Straightforward critique of same-sex relations. What more needs to be said? As I said earlier, there are interpretations of this text that affirm same-sex relations, or at least say that this text does not condemn loving, consensual, monogamous same-sex relations. Let me give you 3 examples of these affirming interpretations. First, some people argue that Paul is only talking here about heterosexuals having homosexual sex. Now, they argue that when Paul says that they exchange natural relations for those who are contrary to nature, he is referring only to those born with heterosexual orientation. The problem, so the argument goes, is that these heterosexuals are acting contrary to their nature, that is, contrary to their orientation. The implication is that what Paul says is not relevant to people born with homosexual orientation. But is that what contrary to nature means? Against one's personal sexual nature or orientation. Second affirming interpretation. Paul is talking about pederasty. In his influential book, Homosexuality in the New Testament, Robin Scroggs argued that the only form of homosexual practice known to Paul was pederasty. This is love of boys, which included an older man having sex with a boy or a younger man. This must be what Paul is critiquing in Romans, so the argument goes, and therefore Romans 1 is irrelevant for our core question of loving, consensual, monogamous same-sex relations. Now, that's an interesting argument, and Scroggs argues it well in his book. Is pederasty the only form of same-sex practice that Paul is concerned about? Third affirming interpretation, Paul here is critiquing excessive lust. Now, some argue that Paul does not condemn all same-sex relations, but only those that result from excessive lust and uncontrollable passions. The argument is based on the observation, an entirely correct observation, I should add, that many Greco-Roman writers from the Greek and the Roman worlds, they believed that same-sex intercourse was the byproduct, was the result of excessive lust gone out of control. And the idea is something like this. Some men got bored with having sex with women. and going out of control with desire for the exotic, they started to have sex with other men, right? So sex with women, too mainstream. Let's try something else, right? Now, if this is what Paul had in mind, then Romans 1 does not apply to loving, consensual, non-lustful same-sex relations. Now, this may be the best of the affirming interpretations of Romans 1. It's certainly held by several who have recently written on the subject. People like Matthew Vines, and before that James Bronson, and the Yale scholar Dale Martin. But is Paul in Romans 1 critiquing only same-sex relations that arise out of excessive lust? Now, all these are interesting arguments that challenge the traditional or the non-affirming interpretation. What can we say about them? Well, there are three observations, I think, which are pertinent. And the first one you might recognize again. The language of mutuality. Just like what we saw with the Leviticus prohibitions, both parties involved in the sex act are considered morally culpable in Romans 1. He says that explicitly for male same-sex partners in verse 27, and probably implies it for female same-sex partners too in verse 26. Furthermore, from what we know from history, female same-sex relations in the ancient world were mainly consensual. Unlike many male same-sex relations, they weren't pederastic. They weren't based on power differences between the parties. So when Paul condemns female same-sex activity in verse 26, and he parallels that with male same-sex activity in verse 27, it seems best to understand Paul to be condemning all same-sex acts, including consensual same-sex acts. Now, all this renders Scrogg's pederasty interpretation highly unlikely. If pederasty was the only form of same-sex practice in view, why would Paul blame both parties, man and boy? And how does one account for Paul's mention of the female same-sex relations, since pederastic relations were hardly known among females in the ancient world? The fact is, there's nothing in Paul's actual language that limits condemnation to more specific forms of same-sex relations. The language is all-inclusive. It's a language of mutuality, mutual culpability and punishment. Paul doesn't refer to rape, he doesn't refer to pederasty or to men having sex with male prostitutes. It's just not explicit. He never singles out the active or the dominant partner of the sex act, which is what you would expect if his condemnation was about exploitation in same-sex activity. Yes, Paul would condemn all these forms of same-sex activity, but his language in Romans 1 is too general to be limited to only these.